Anyway, Patrick Moore has done a number of videos for PragerU, including this one on climate change. Here again is his main argument.
Only constant is change. That's true about life, and it's true about the climate. The climate is always changing, it always has, and it always will.
If this sounds familiar, it's because, like nearly all of Moore's arguments, it comes straight off the blogosphere.
Climate change is a natural phenomenon, always been, but always will be.
The climate has always been changing. There has never been a time when the climate has not changed.
But that's like claiming bacteria can't cause epidemics because there have always been epidemics. Or plate tectonics can't cause earthquakes because there have always been earthquakes. How does the fact that the climate's always changed preclude carbon dioxide as being the cause of that change? Unwittingly, by trying to show that CO2 and climate can't possibly be linked, Moore gives us some good examples of that very link.
The evidence is actually against the hypothesis that we're causing the warming, because there's been warming and cooling cycles all through the history of life, and some of them are longer than others. Like the last ice age before this one was 300 million years ago.
Indeed it was, and studies show that the cause of the last ice age 300 million years ago was a drop in CO2 concentration as carbon dioxide was weathered out of the atmosphere to form limestones and absorbed and buried by forests to form coal. Moore doesn't present any evidence that the studies are flawed, he simply doesn't mention them.
And then it was warm for nearly 300 million years.
Yes, it became warm again when huge quantities of CO2 were pumped into the atmosphere by two flood basalt events called the Siberian Traps and the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province. And since higher levels of carbon dioxide cause warming, the Earth got warmer. It really isn't much of a paradox to people who study this. It fits perfectly well with the role of CO2 as the main driver of long-term climate. So Moore's simple observation that it got colder and then it got warmer is perfectly compatible with the scientific conclusion that it got colder because CO2 levels fell and it got warmer because CO2 levels rose. He's got one more example, which I'm sure will also be compatible, but let's hear it anyway.
Before it got cold again like it is now.
And as you can guess, the cooling trend coincided with a fall in CO2 concentration as carbon dioxide was weathered out of the atmosphere and deposited as calcium carbonate in limestone. So Moore can give as many examples as he likes of changing climate, but none of that is incompatible with the conclusion of researchers that these changes were caused by carbon dioxide. Interestingly, Moore doesn't even try to rebut the mountain of research that shows CO2 is the cause of these changes in climate. He doesn't even refer to it. So we can cross that argument off the list. Next, we come to the weed killer incident. Oh no, sorry, I forgot. We must never mention the weed killer incident. So next we come to Moore's claim that there are other reasons why the Earth might be warming.
There are many more factors in play than simply the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. Factors such as the shape and size of the Earth's elliptical orbit around the Sun, activity from the Sun, and the amount of wobble or tilt in the Earth's axis, among many others.
We'll come to fluctuations in the Sun in a minute. But is Moore really saying that the warming we're experiencing is due to changes in the Earth's tilt and orbit? If he is, well, that's a very easy claim to demolish. The Earth's tilt and orbit are well understood and very predictable. So predictable that they trigger glacial and interglacial periods with clockwork regularity. Right now, these factors are giving us a fairly benign climate, and we're not expecting to begin our descent into the next glaciation for another 16,000 to 20,000 years. So no one can seriously claim that orbital shift is a factor in warming over the last 40 years, because that would require some sort of divine intervention, and astronomers and geophysicists would have noticed. So let's get back to Moore's other factor in climate change.
Activity from the Sun.
Yes, of course, the Sun's a factor in climate change. Put simply, when solar irradiance rises, it puts upward pressure on temperature. When solar irradiance falls, it puts downward pressure on temperature. Does anyone seriously disagree? So, since solar irradiance has been steady and then falling over the last 40 years, that should have been putting downward pressure on global temperatures, right? but global temperatures have been rising.
It's the sun, stupid.
No, clearly it's not. It's more accurate to say it can't possibly be the sun, stupid, unless you think that turning down a heater would cause a room to get warmer. So something else is causing record warming. Why does Moore think it can't possibly be carbon dioxide?
So then what about carbon dioxide, the great villain of the global warming alarmists? Where does that fit into this picture? Not as neatly as you might think. Temperatures and carbon dioxide levels do not show a strong correlation. In fact, over very long time spans, periods of hundreds of millions of years, they are often completely out of sync with one another. Here you have a complete reversal of the idea that CO2 causes warming, where they are at exact opposites with each other, and in fact, most of the time, they're pretty much out of sync. And it shows very clearly that there's no lockstep correlation between CO2 and global temperature.
Anyone who's watched my videos will know that this one also comes from a blog by a coal mining engineer, Monty Heeb. Heeb simply stuck two graphs together. One is a temperature sketch by Scotese in 1999, which Scotese derived from a book by Frakes in 1992. And Heeb got the CO2 data from a study called Geocarb 3, published in 2001 by Berner et al. Now let's be a teeny bit skeptical and check the sources of both graphs. Frakes, the author of the temperature data, says the warming periods are due to relatively high levels of CO2. Conversely, cooler periods are due to lower levels of CO2. Berner, writing 8 years later, says that over the long term there's a correlation between CO2 and temperature. Let's leave aside the question of whether Moore actually read their studies. The nub of the issue is why Moore concludes that there's no correlation when the authors, and every other researcher in this field, says there is a correlation. Just looking at these graphs would suggest that Moore is right. So is there something the researchers know that Moore isn't telling us? It turns out, yes, there is. Like all the bloggers he copied from, Moore completely omitted the warming effect of the sun. Sorry if you've heard this before, but the sun has been growing steadily hotter over time, so there's no better a correlation between the sun and global temperature over the last 500 million years than there is between CO2 and global temperature. But no one would be daft enough to conclude from this obvious lack of correlation that the sun has no effect on temperature. It's a combination of solar forcing and carbon dioxide forcing that gives us a good correlation with global temperature. Correlation doesn't necessarily mean causation, of course, but it is consistent with the overwhelming body of evidence that CO2 is a major driver of climate. And it completely demolishes Moore's claim that there's no correlation to begin with. Ironically, Moore can only support this non-correlation claim by completely leaving out the effect of the sun, something that he's been so insistent on calling a big factor in climate change.
It's the sun, stupid.
If only Moore had recognized and included the growing output of the sun in his model, he would have been able to answer his own question about past climate very easily.
Here there was an ice age when CO2 was at least 10 times higher than it is today.
So why was there an ice age when CO2 was 10 times higher than today? Because, as we've seen, the sun was much, much weaker than today. Why did we come out of that ice age? Because CO2 levels rose. The last internet myth Moore presents at public speaking events is the old one about climate change stopped 15 or 18 or 19 or, in Moore's case, 20 years ago.
Contrary to media headlines, the trend over the past couple of decades has been essentially flat.
No, it hasn't. All the temperature measurements show, and all the major climatological institutes in the world agree, that temperatures have been rising for 40 years, including the last 20. Simply repeating a shop-worn blogosphere myth won't make it magically come true. That's pretty much all of Patrick Moore's claims against carbon dioxide debunked. If you thought, well, that was easy, yes, it was, because, as I always say, you don't need to be a genius to check facts. Just have a bit of skepticism and the ability to look things up. In Moore's case, it's even easier because since nearly all his claims are copied off the internet, I've already debunked them in previous videos. Moore is never exposed to criticism like this because he always plays